Hello and welcome to our webinar, the latest webinar with agility. And I have a special guest with me today. I have Sana from Consia, and this is how to scale your.
Sana Remicki, co-founder and CEO of Consia. We offer a headless, actually the very first truly headless personalization engine in the market. And I'm really excited to talk to you all about what personalization is all about and how to fit that into your composable tech stack today.
Awesome. So what will you learn today? We're going to learn a whole new strategy for personalization, which Sana's going to take us through. Number two, how the modern technology, things like headless, can enable much better personalization. I think personalization gets a bad rap sometimes because it's known as very complex. Sana's going to take us through that and sort of teach us how it really works and how we can orchestrate it, and really show us how to get started. So let's dive right in. Tell us a little bit more about Consia.
Awesome. So Consia actually has a couple of different products. One of them is a DX engine, which is the personalization and orchestration platform. We've specifically built the DX engine to work within a composable tech stack. It allows you, it gives you the freedom to really build your own digital stack with best of breed CMSs, commerce engines, customer data platforms, etc. So let's get into it, and I'll explain how we think about personalization, and hopefully learn something during this webinar.
Yeah, just before we go forward, I just want to sort of frame this a little bit. It's about what Consia is as a platform. So it's a SaaS platform that it's not a, it's not something where you host a website or anything like that. It's a platform where basically someone subscribes to you, pays a yearly fee or whatever for your APIs essentially, right?
Yes, that's exactly it.
Awesome. Yeah, it's not a CD-ROM that you put into your computer as a
No,
product. Yeah.
or a
Those days
cassette.
are long gone. All right, let's get into it.
Awesome. All right. So the way we think about personalization is that we believe a personalized experience brings together the customer and the content in the right context at the right time, right? So when you think about the customer data comes from a lot of different first party and third party sources. You have data coming from customer service, surveys, and forms that you may have on your website. You're collecting real-time behavioral data or interaction data about the customer, email engagement, CRMs, and a lot more from any channel that you can think about. When you think about content, this is where a lot of people don't think about the fact that content is also coming from a lot of different data sources and content sources. Yes, a lot of organizations are starting to move towards a headless CMS, but there is still a lot of content sitting in legacy and monolith DXPs and web CMSs that it is not easy to move out of the existing repositories overnight, right? So you need to think about content that's sitting in all sorts of systems and repositories, like your product catalog, articles, news, blogs, videos, marketing copy, presentation logic, all of that. We got to think about when we're thinking about personalization. It's not just about knowing the customer, it's about knowing where your content sits and what content needs to be presented to the customer in each of the various contexts and throughout the customer journey. And the customer journey is not just the web, right? You have web, you have mobile, you have chatbots, you have voice search, smart devices, etc. So when you're thinking about these three key concepts for personalization, you got to look at the plurality of all of these concepts, right? Multiple content
Mhm.
sources, multiple customer data sources, and multiple contexts. So personalization at scale is all about addressing that plurality. If you want to go to the next
Can I
slide,
actually
or
just
sure,
just to I
yeah.
want to dive a little bit deeper because I get a lot of questions when I talk to customers about a user identity and things like that. So
Mhm.
just going back to the customer side of things, could this be an anonymous person that hasn't necessarily logged into my website, but you've got the idea of behavioral data or the journey that I've clicked through. Is that enough to identify a user?
Not to identify the user fully, but at least know something about the user that you can use to provide contextual content to
Right.
them in real time. It may not be as relevant as if you know the person's history and their psychographic and attitudinal information,
Right.
but there is something to key off your content and product recommendations for
So
sure.
yeah, so that's going to come down to a user requirement to say, hey, do I need to have that, and do I have a data platform that's going to basically know that, or it could be as simple as, hey, what country are you browsing from in
Exactly.
this place, right? In terms of
Exactly.
that,
For sure. And I think it depends on the maturity of the
right,
organization. Organizations that are just at the beginning of their personalization initiatives may just start with dealing with just the real time aspects of the customer and real time behavior that they can use to personalize content, whereas others that are a little bit further down their personalization journey may start to actually build a customer data platform or buy a customer data platform to
right.
start to collect data from all the various sources and do identity resolution to create that customer identity graph, which they can use to build very powerful personalizations off of.
Right. So the more we know about the customer, the better. And if,
The
for instance,
better
it
the
could be,
personalization's going to get.
yeah, it could be that they've
Definitely.
logged into the system and we know them directly because, they chose that, hey, I'm interested in whatever. Um, Now, one of the words that I don't see on here is the word that I hear a lot is the word audience. How does an audience fit into this model? I know you wanted to get on to the next slide and I'm holding you up,
No,
but
no, no.
I
This is
just wanted to
actually
clarify.
really, really good. Really good question. So, audience is really just a segment of all of your customers, right?
Right.
So, if you have a customer database with a full list of all of your customers, audiences are just segments of those
Right.
customers essentially, and you can divide up customers based on various characteristics about them, right? You may say this is a segment of customers from ages 25 to 40. This is a segment of all females. This is a segment of luxury buyers and whatnot. So a CDP, which typically collects all of the data about the customer, has the ability to segment off the audience in such a way that you can personalize at the audience level.
Right.
So if you're not yet at the stage where you're ready to do one-to-one personalization, the next step after being able to personalize at the real-time behavioral level is audience level
Right.
personalization. So definitely a very good question, and a lot of, I would say, a majority of personalization initiatives get stuck at the audience level.
Right.
And we want to talk about why that is when we talk about personalization at scale. It's not that they don't want to do one-to-one personalization. It's just hard to do one-to-one personalization, and that's part of that
Right.
scale
So
that we'll talk about.
audience level personalization to like these greater segments is probably like the good, and the best is to be able to combine, all of our data to do one-to-one personalization on a customer basis. That's awesome.
Exactly.
All right.
Exactly. Awesome.
Talk to me about content and data.
All right. So, yeah, so this slide basically is a representation of how content and data are both siloed across the
Mhm.
organization. The way tech stacks were built over time is that they were aligned with the channels that you're serving. So, you may end up having content that was built specifically for the web, or built specifically for chatbot, or specifically for your mobile application. Same thing with data. You end up having a user database for the web, another user database on the CRM side. So the sales is looking at a completely different user database than your website is, right? And so when you're thinking about a more holistic approach to personalization and scaling out your personalization efforts, you really need to unify the data and the content from all of these different systems in a way that you create that connected and cohesive and unified experience across all channels. Any questions about this, Joel?
Well,
Before?
this diagram, it just gives me heart palpitations when I look at it, and then I go back in time and it's like, hey, well, I wonder if there's a way to sync our user databases across the different things and stuff like
Yeah,
that. So yeah, this is a good problem to solve. Absolutely.
definitely. Awesome.
So yeah, I mean, it really brings to light what challenges do data silos like this create when we're talking about personalization in particular?
Right. So lots of different challenges, but definitely in relation to personalization, one of the key challenges is that you end up having inconsistent experiences
Right.
across all channels. So when it comes to personalization initiatives, what ends up happening is that those initiatives are also siloed based on the channel, right? So you end up using some sort of tooling that is aligned to a specific channel to create or execute your personalization initiatives. And that's a problem, right? Because the customer at the end of the day, they're not just looking at your website or not just going to the mobile application. They want to hear the same message
Right.
throughout their customer journey, and that's impossible if you manage personalization at the end channel level. It needs to be
Right.
centralized, right? But if the data and content are not centralized, how do you do that? That's what we're
Right.
going to get into in a bit, right? So complexity is another um, big concern, right? So a lot
Mhm.
of times the intent is there to have a cohesive and consistent approach to personalization, but it is very, very complex, right? Your data is all over the place. Content is all over the place. So organizations just kind of give up on the idea of consistent experiences because it's just too complex to, like you said, you have heart palpitations
Yeah.
from
Well, then
from
the
syncing databases, right?
multiple points of failure is like multiple single points of failure. It's like yeah. When everything is separated like that, everything can fail, and nothing is going to be in a good state necessarily as it gets bigger and more complex. Not good.
Exactly. And one of the biggest challenges that Joe, you're going to be speaking about when it comes to a headless CMS, what a headless CMS solves for is, the difficulty in keeping content and presentation separate.
Hmm.
When your DXPs are aligned to a specific channel, most DXPs are aligned to the web channel specifically. Lot of focus is given to the web, and organizations forget about the fact that we're gonna need to meet the customer where they are, and that's
Right.
not only the web, right? And so that's one big issue when it comes to the data silo challenges is just and keeping all of this content and presentation together, which just makes it very difficult to reuse that content and reuse the logic for what customers should see where and in what context throughout the customer journey.
And they kind of work together as well, because I think about going back to what you're first talking about with customer experience. We want to make sure that we just get consistent messaging and brand experience, because
Right.
obviously, I think it makes a lot of sense that if that's an inconsistent experience, then our brand doesn't have as much value and the message doesn't have as much weight. But if I wanted to have a similar message going out to, either a user or a cohort of users in a segment that has the same thing across, the website, and as well as maybe
Right.
all the emails that they get, a lot of times that is seen as too complex to get that content to be reusable to get a good experience. So they all work together, right?
They
This
they
is definitely a
definitely do.
challenge.
It's an organization-wide strategy, and the headless approach has to be adopted
Right.
across all divisions of the organization. You can't think of it as we're just going to have a headless CMS for the web.
Right. Yeah.
Um,
Doesn't do
I
enough.
mean, why do you need a headless CMS for the web only, right?
Right.
You might as well go with the DXP if you don't have a cross-channel strategy
Right.
at all. But that's the problem. If you're not moving towards a cross-channel or an omni-channel strategy, you're going to be left behind, right? So it's definitely something to think about.
Yeah, we want to skate to where the puck is going to go, right? Let's talk from Canadian terms here, right? We got to get
Yeah,
we want
exactly.
to be future proof on
We
this. All
have a
right,
game
cool.
today, and we're going to win
That's
that
right.
game. Yeah.
Absolutely. So
um,
yeah, you're
all
kind of
right.
you're kind of leading me to the idea of a composable architecture as being a good thing, and of course, that's speaking my language. That's definitely what we've been talking about on this series. This is a big list of a lot of different composable type things.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. So you saw the slide earlier where we talked about data silos. Now, the data silos problem's not going to get any better with a composable architecture, if you, especially if you don't do it right. Right?
Right.
If you just, sprinkle together a whole bunch of technologies and use them across a whole bunch of different channels, and there is no centralized unified strategy for content and a centralized strategy for data, all of these applications either have data or they have content or they have business logic or a combination of all of them, right? So when we're picking your best of breed technologies to build your own composable tech stack, it's important to stand back and see how exactly these technologies are going to fit in my omni-channel strategy, and how exactly am I going to personalize the content that is sitting in technology one versus two, and
Mhm.
if the data is being situated in all of these different places, how am I going to merge all of that data together? Are
Yeah.
these systems that I'm working with open enough? Do they have that open architecture? Do they have the right level of APIs for me to pull the data or push the content in and out of these systems, right? So composable is great, and it's definitely the way the world is going. But the complexity does go up, and
Right.
when it comes to a composable architecture, you need to orchestrate and coordinate content and data across multiple systems to really achieve that true, consistent personalization across
Right.
channels.
Right.
Yeah,
Which leads us to, yeah, this is, I mean, this diagram, I think if you've been following along with this webinar series, we kind of show this a lot, which is a much simplified version of kind of what you saw on the previous screen of how composable DXP, the different components of it work together. Headless CMS kind of sits at the middle because that's where all your content is. And we want that content to be available across all of our channels. And personalization as well, it needs to be, especially if it's headless personalization, which makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense for all of these, by the way, to be headless API-based systems, I believe. And that way they can all work to deliver content to all of your channels and sort of get rid of that idea of silos. So I really like how our Sana is really, I like our conversations because I think we sort of meet each other at the same space because we're trying to get to the same goal. So this is great.
absolutely. All right.
All right. So this is where you're kind of starting to start walking us through the fundamentals of how we understand personalization and sort of lead us towards how we can get started with it.
Exactly. So these are the same, fundamentals that we used when we built the DX engine. We thought about, what are all of the challenges that we face in the industry today, and how do we solve all of these challenges? So one of the biggest challenge is, being able to personalize across various channels, and personalize in a way that is not going to cause a ton of work for business users. So the very first foundation of that is making sure that you're personalizing at a modular level and not
Mhm.
a page level. The idea of the page came from web CMSs, right?
Right.
It came from a single channel approach to personalization. And now that we are starting to think about content being reusable across multiple channels, you need to also think about personalizing that content at that modular or individual content level, so that not only are you reusing content across multiple channels, you're also reusing personalized content
Right.
across multiple channels, right? So for instance, if I have a module on the page for product recommendations or content recommendations, if I come on the web, I should see the same recommendations as when I go to my mobile application. Or
Right.
if I receive an email from a brand, I expect to
Yes.
see exactly the same recommendations, right? So if you don't personalize at a modular level, what ends up happening is that inconsistency once again
Mhm.
across channels. If you go to the next slide for a second.
Yeah.
Actually, yes. Yeah,
So
go ahead.
this is
Yeah,
where we wanted to bring into the content
yeah,
part of it a little bit because as a headless CMS, it helps you set up your content so that it can be personalized. And this is the language I speak a lot because Agility itself as a headless CMS doesn't do personalization in terms of all the stuff that like the Conceal product does, but it does allow you to set up your content so that it can be personalized. And that starts with your content model, like what fields are available. And then we want to link that content to basically the idea of audiences so that we can say this content is for a particular audience. We could even go to the point as this content is for a particular person, but more than likely we're going to tag it to get it more specific in terms of the demographics that we're targeting for our audiences and segments. And then we want to use those headless APIs to deliver the content. We don't want to, there's no point, I think you kind of said this before, Sana. It's like there's no point setting up a headless CMS and then not actually using it in a centralized way to kind of break up the data silos. So we want to make sure that we use the headless APIs in the right way. And just talking about content models. So a basic content model for a product would basically have a product and just the product fields that describe the product itself. But when we're modeling our content with audiences in mind, we want to include something about the audiences in the product content model itself. So I might have, it's as simple as including an audience field. And then instead of having a single product, now I'm going to have 3 products, one of which will be sent to you based on the audience that you are part of. That the personalization engine decides that, I'm going to serve you the product for audience 2 as opposed to the other ones. And this is just the most basic example. As your content model gets more complex and as you get more audiences and segments and targets, things like that, then you're going to have, basically take all that into account when
For
you're
sure.
building up your content model.
I'll add something to this as well, actually, Joel. So, when it comes to modeling your content, as you said, tagging it with audience is definitely a start. But, Agility has the ability to tag it with other types of tags or classifications as well, which a personalization engine such as Concea's DX engine can combine multiple tags to say,
Right.
hey, for a customer from this particular segment, show them content that has tag 1, 2, 3, and 4, but not 5, right?
Right.
So the personalization engine needs to be able to use the tags that are on the content, the metadata that is on the content, in such a way that provides business users the control to decide how exactly we're going to create a filtered set of
Right.
content items dynamically for a specific audience segment or for a specific customer. One of the things that we can even think about, and we'll talk about this when we get into orchestration, as well as if you have a CDP, right, in play, and the CDP provides you in real time information about a specific profile, right? So customer profile 1, 2, 3. Show me everything that you know about that person. Now, CDPs have the ability to calculate things like propensity or affinities related
Right.
to content or products. So the CDP may tell you that, hey, for this particular customer, their affinity is with category jewelry, right? And brand Michael Kors, right? So now, if that's the case, you could have your content tagged with brand and category. Whereas, so in real time, the personalization engine can orchestrate the data that is coming from the CDP and create a filtered query to the Agility CMS to
Right.
really just take a subset. Oh, sorry about that. To take a subset of the content and provide that to the customer as real time, content
Right.
recommendations as well. So we can do a lot with just having the right content model and
Right.
then having the right abstracted orchestration layer that has the ability to manipulate queries to the backend CMSs or the product catalogs in real time based on that metadata.
Awesome. So we've got our content modeled and we've followed that level. And now we want to do this component level modular personalization. And just to go back to the concept of that before, because you're right,
Mhm.
you kind of skipped over it because it seems an obvious thing, but maybe it's not. So previous personalizations, a lot of them did things like page level redirects. So it's like instead of sending me to the slash product page, I end up going to the product USA page and it just gives me USA, which first of all, it's like the whole page changes and pages changing doesn't work when I'm sending emails and things like that. So it's not omni-channel, but also it's very macro. That doesn't let me do individual level things. So
Yeah.
that's kind of what you meant by the modular level, component level personalization, right?
Absolutely, absolutely, and in the old world where you were doing page level personalization, when we talk about scale, when we start adding, markets and audience segments and
Hmm.
languages and regions and geographies to the mix, you're multiplying out all of the different variations that you need to create, and just imagine the maintenance, hazard
Nightmare,
when it
nightmare.
comes to
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
Right. So now content creators are literally duplicating the page one by one, changing the one little thing on the page that needs to be slightly different for
yeah. We don't
this
want to do that.
particular.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So I think you can already imagine, if you go to the next slide, that actually explains that phenomena fairly well. I actually got
Mm,
this from Forrester. And what it's trying to explain is that if you do that um, page level personalization, you end up
right,
multiplying out the content
right,
variations that you have to create. So 9 times 9 times 9 times 9 for each of the different pages, for each of the products, markets, personas,
right.
and channels. Whereas if you start to reuse components, if you think about a page and that has 5 different modules, going from audience segment 1 to audience segment 2 may only require a variation on one of the components, not the entire page. Most of the page looks exactly the same. It's just this one component that
Right,
changed. So instead of having to create a brand new page for that audience, what if you could personalize just that one module?
right.
And then the page generates itself automatically in real time, right? And that is key, right? So do personalization, or define the personalization logic at a component or module level, so that
Hmm.
that module can be reused across all pages, all screens, all channels, across the board, rather than having to duplicate that effort, right? So 6,500 copies versus 36 is much better
Yeah.
that
Well,
way.
and this also fits into what a lot of developers are using on the technical side, is the idea of component driven development, where they're
Right.
actually building components that match up to these modules. I really like how that works
Exactly.
here. We're speaking the same language here. This is great. Even Forrester agrees with us.
Oh, and they agreed with us I think this was like, oh yeah, a year and a half ago, when I got this. And when I saw this, I was like, oh, this is exactly what we're trying to do here. That's
Yes.
great. That's awesome.
Perfect. Okay.
Okay, so I think we've covered the first two, the
Hmm.
modular and the headless concept. So the third concept is around orchestration, and this concept comes in when you're dealing with a composable tech stack with multiple content sources, multiple data sources, and you need to be able to orchestrate the content and the data to create that um, personalized experience,
Right.
right? So if you go to the next slide, I'll give you an example of what orchestration entails, right? So this is an example which I sort of touched on earlier, where you may you may have a CDP, um, such as segment. Um, and so in this picture, segments at the very top, you're getting a call to the personalization engine. The DX engine is in gray here, which is orchestrating the data and the content across the board. So the channel, such as web, from a specific, let's say, homepage, provides you with a customer ID, right? Now the DX engine is going to take that customer ID and send that customer ID through an API call to the customer profile component, which is a logical component within the DX engine that has the connection to segment, right? Segment then comes back with the customer profile in real time, and says the customer segment is this, and the customer affinities are that, and the customer's propensity to buy and churn is X, Y, and Z, right? So now we have a full customer profile in front of us. Now, at that point, the DX engine is going to take that information, parse that out, and set that as the real time context of the customer. So it's pulling out the customer segment in this particular case.
Right.
Now, now that we have the customer context, which includes all of this information, such as location, customer segment, device, all of that, it's going to send another request through the promo banner component to Agility, right?
Right.
And Agility is going to come back with the right promo banner based on the tags and the metadata that were
Right.
assigned to specific content pieces. The DX engine then brings all that information back, packages it together, and then sends it across to the channel that requested the personalized recommendations for the promo banner. And it can do that for all of the various components, such as product recommendations. They may be coming
Right.
from BigCommerce,
Right.
right? So that's so the idea is that you don't want to have to take all the content and product data from all of the various backend systems and centralize them first, and integrate them and sync all that data into a central place before doing personalization. You want to be able to do personalization while keeping the data and the content where it sits,
Right.
right? So that's a very, very important point. A lot of integration challenges, come about, and organizations have to suffer with keeping data in sync when they have to move that
Right.
data around into a central repository for the purpose of personalization, right?
Yeah.
So what we believe in is the right approach, is to do orchestration rather than integration,
Ah.
right?
Yes.
So keep the data where it is. Keep the content in Agility. No need to pull that content out of Agility into the DX engine and then do your personalization on that data. Just keep it there and use the power of the APIs that these headless platforms already expose,
Right.
right? Agility
Yep.
has APIs to be able to filter the content and search through the content in real time. So
Yep.
if we have the intelligence on who should see what, we should be able to formulate the right query in a dynamic fashion, so that we don't have to first bring that content out of Agility and then run that logic on it, right?
I love this. I love this diagram because it kind of tells a story, right? Someone comes in, they're browsing, they have a customer ID, so we can get the customer profile, but we also have all this other context information about them. And now the orchestration platform itself, personalization platform, can use that context to go and query all of these platforms. And it could be, we've just got a few here. There could be just a few platforms. There could be just one. It could be anyone. And these can evolve over time. And the
Right.
orchestration layer can just know about all that and just deliver that as raw content to be used in whatever channel it needs to be. It's just going to be, structured content that fits into the models. I just love this diagram. It's great.
Awesome. And this, by the way, this type of orchestration is typically done in code, right?
Right.
So that's another very key point. And if you go to the next slide, we'll talk about that. What actually, I'll get back to intelligence in a second, but business led, right? So all personalization efforts are going to fail 100% if you don't keep the business involved
Right.
in those, right? Business, wants something today and is going to change their mind tomorrow, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? So
Mhm.
you can't use what they're telling you today to build in and hard code all of this logic into the orchestration layer that you are customizing on server side or client side. You need to
Right.
give the business the control, a zero code, intuitive interface to be able to put in that logic and set the rules for personalization on their own. And that's another
Right.
key thing. So orchestration doesn't mean it's a bunch of custom code. It just
Ah,
means that it's built in such a way that it is completely zero code and and accessible to business users to configure.
ah,
And so those components that we were talking about, such as the customer profile component and the product recommendations or content recommendations component, in the DX engine, we actually link them in a way that business can say, if the customer segment is X, show them Y,
right.
or simply take the product affinities that are coming from the profile
Yeah.
and filter the content immediately with those filters in place, right? So there's no code when it comes to that personalization layer,
Right. Just
right?
a level of configuration. Awesome.
Configuration that business can understand. So it's all abstracted out so that business can understand it. They know that they're setting a rule for certain campaigns, for
Yes.
certain channels, for certain contexts, right? And there's no developer
Yeah,
involvement
because three
involved.
minutes later, when the requirement changes, the business needs to be able
Exactly.
to go in and reconfigure it without us having to go and talk to the developers. So like, hey, you're gonna have to go change your code. No, we don't want to do that. We'll
Exactly.
just reconfigure something in the orchestration layer, and now
That's right.
the content is going to be more relevant, hopefully, for that user based on what we've measured. Awesome.
That's exactly it. And then finally, intelligence, right? So, you may be thinking, so far we've talked about a very rule-based approach to personalization. Is there more to it, right? We hear a lot about intelligent
Mhm.
recommendations, and what does an intelligent recommendation really mean, right? So if you go to the next slide, Joel, um, intelligence comes from knowing your customer, right? So if you remember the first slide where we had a bunch of these dots with data sources
Mhm.
that hold on to customer data, like real-time behavioral data, customer service data, CRM data, right? All of those are giving you some intelligence and insights about the customer, right? So identity information, which they have declared at some point in their journey, to attitudinal information like how does this customer seem to feel about my brand, how are they interacting with the brand, what kind of buyer are they, do they plan on buying something or not, right? So all
Right.
that information can actually be extracted at the customer level, right, inside a customer data platform or a customer identity graph, such as the Concierge customer identity graph, where we're using machine learning and analytics to first create the traits and the like the traits about the customer and the knowledge around the customer, creating that unified single view of the customer,
Right.
that profile that can then once you have that profile, right, that is the intelligent profile. The profile itself should tell you, what do I want to buy,
Yes.
or what kind of content am I interested in, right? And if now you have the intelligence on the customer side, and as we discussed earlier, if you also have the intelligence on the content side, right? So you have the right tags, the right metadata on the content as well, then it's a matter of linking the two to
Right.
create the intelligent recommendations. And that's what the orchestration layer should do, which is abstract it out both from the backend content sources and data sources, as well as from the front end, so that it can sit sort of in isolation in a very central way and
Right.
control how content and data are coordinated with each other. So there is, of course, some work to be done to think about what your customer profile should look like, what type of what type of information do you want on the profile so that
Mhm.
it matches to some degree with the content that you
Right.
have, right? So
Yeah.
the content and the data have to be coordinated. You can't do personalization if there's no match between the two,
Yeah,
right?
because the goal, I mean, we didn't even talk about this with personalization, but I mean, the goal is to improve the engagement with
Yeah.
whatever you're delivering them in terms of engagement with the experience that you're creating, but also just improve the conversion rate. We want to sell more product. We want to get more, people to actually interact with things and fill out forms and all these kind of things that we want to
Hmm.
drive in terms of an outcome. And then what you've talked about is the ability to configure the orchestration platform to optimize that, but then to add a level of intelligence onto there so that the platform
Right.
itself can be smarter in terms of
That's right.
optimizing those responses. That's awesome. Brilliant.
Great. Let's go to the next slide. All right. So when we're thinking about headless personalization, we need to have a framework to think about it. And this is the
Mhm.
framework that we used when we built the DX engine. We needed a way that is completely, channel agnostic as well as backend agnostic. So there's a concept of channels, right? So you may have your web, mobile, voice channel, chat bots, etc. So you define within the platform, you define, okay, what are all my channels that I'm working with? Now, what are all my templates? These templates could be reused across channels. For instance, a template could be a home screen or a home page, but the same template may be available on the web as well as on mobile, right? So template itself is also channel agnostic and reusable across channels. And a template is simply, you can think of it as a composition of components, right? So you have individual modules of content that need to be that need to be personalized, and a template is simply just assembling them together and providing them to the front end. So when you make a call to the personalization engine, you're asking for a template. You don't have to ask for individual components. You're just saying, give me the home page template or a home template, and it just provides, an image banner, a video, some, goes and gets the customer profile, all of those things, all the components, brings them together, assembles them, and provides them to the front end. Now, components could be of two types. They could be either renderable. I didn't want to say visual because there are, we have voice search now as well, so that's not visual, right? Or AR and VR experiences. So it has to be either renderable or it's logical, right? A renderable component is something that is going to tell the front end the instructions on how to render a visual or a voice experience. A logical component, on the other hand, is something that will do some work. It may be that it's going to call a third-party service, a web service, get some information, parse it out, and maybe pass it on to another component, right? So that's a logical component. And components can interact with each other, right? So one component could actually be an input to another component as well. And as you saw with the orchestration logic we talked about with the customer data platform and the content, the customer profile is an input essentially to the product recommendations or content recommendations component, right? So you need to be able to orchestrate them between each other, not just go back to the back end, get the data, and then just give it to the front end. It's about coordinating amongst the tech stack pieces as well. And then finally, there's this concept of connections, right? So you want to be able to have real-time connections to commerce engines, your CMSs, your CDPs, etc. Right? And each of these components are connected to specific connections, so they can go pull data or content from there. And I can't stress this point enough that the orchestration engine or the personalization engine needs to be 100% headless. There are orchestration platforms. They call themselves orchestration platforms, but they're really front-end platforms just making calls to back-end to fill certain parts of the page. So I have a component for navigation, and for navigation, I'm going to go get my content from Algolia, for instance. That's not orchestration. That's just integration. Orchestration is when you have multiple backend systems, multiple backend content and data sources, and you need to make them work together as well. So there's coordination between them.
Now,
So
just in terms of, can you clarify a little bit about what I'm as an output in terms of, so components can be combined together into templates, but those templates, they're not, is that going to be like HTML content that I would render, or is it just data structures that I can then interpret with whatever rendering engine I need?
It's just a data structure. It's a JSON response. So especially when we're working with, headless CMSs like Agility, you guys yourself are providing content in a JSON format, right? There's no HTML cluttered into that content, right? So what we're doing is essentially just assembling JSON objects from multiple backend systems, combining them together based on the rules and the logic that business users have set, and just delivering that as is to the front end. So the front end, The presentation layer is completely decoupled from the back end.
That's gold, Sana. That's
Right?
gold. Love it. That's so.
Awesome.
That's how it's a headless framework. Is essentially it's just another data API that orchestrates it all, puts it all together, chooses the right content, and magically gives it to you. That is
Gives it
awesome.
to you.
So great. Cool.
All right. So finally, where does a headless experience engine sit? I think from our conversations, it's probably become fairly obvious, but this is just a kind of nice diagram to just show
Mhm.
you, what are some of the content platforms that are out there? What are the commerce engines? What are the search platforms? What kind of backend data does a headless experience engine orchestrate, right? So
Mhm.
so it sits between your backend and your front end frameworks. It has nothing to do with the backend and nothing to do with the front end, other than it's able to connect to both, right, through APIs, right?
Yeah.
APIs that connect to the backend to get data and content, and then it delivers that content to the front end through APIs as well, right? So you have platforms like front end frameworks like Next.js or Vue.js, and there
Mhm.
are some front end frameworks that, for example, Builder is built on some of those more
Right.
the same sort of technologies like Next.js
Mhm.
that give business users the tool to manipulate the front end experience, at least from a web standpoint. But since the headless experience engine is completely agnostic of the presentation layer, it can deliver the content to any front end, including an email or a chat
Yeah.
bot
So
as
as
well.
you add more channels, and this is one of the things we get in with headless CMS all the time, is as you add more channels into your sort of ecosystem of front ends out there, you can just continue to use the same orchestration, or maybe continue to configure it in new and special ways. But that's going to be consistent across all those platforms. And as
That's
you, because everyone does, redesign your website and your mobile apps and all your different front ends, as you change
right.
those and they evolve, you can keep the same orchestration layer and
Yes.
continue to
Yes.
have that. It's not dependent on a front end, uh, aka it's headless.
Exactly.
Yeah, brilliant.
Exactly. That is absolutely key. You can't put an orchestration layer into the front end, because if you change that front end, then all that work is gone, and you're
Yeah,
also then tying your orchestration with a specific channel, so it's not
right.
consistent across all channels as well. So I
So
think
yeah,
that's really all. I think the content that I had that I could walk through today. Any questions that
yeah,
Joel, you
Sana.
have?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's going to be tons of questions from the folks that are watching. So if you're either watching this live or recorded, throw those in the chat, or I'm going to give you some connections to reach out. I'm going to give one word of warning, just going back to headless for a second. Be wary of systems that say that they're headless, but they're actually not. Things can have
Oh yes.
APIs and things attached to them, like that seem like APIs, but they're actually not. And that's a good reason to connect with myself or with Sana or with some experts in the field to sort of research what does headless mean, especially with regards to things like orchestration and personalization, in terms of that, because it's a kind of I think CANCIA is very unique in that regard at this point, and it's something really important to have continue this conversation and sort of go deeper into what that actually means and how it benefits you. So by all means, by all measures of this, we want to continue the conversation. You can follow Agility at Agility CMS on Twitter, CANCIA at CANCIA Corp. There will be more events coming at agilitymS.com/events, and follow Sana and the rest of the CANCIA folks at linkedin.com/company/CANCIA, or you can always just do the old school email and just send us emails. Sana, you've been a
Uh,
wonderful guest. You have taught me so much about personalization orchestration in this conversation alone, and in our other conversations. I really appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you, Joel. It was my pleasure.
Okay, and thank you for the rest of you joining us. And until next time, take care.